Greetings. Father Mark signing on from St. Louis King of France Parish in Bucktown, Louisiana on the first day of July 2020. An alteration in the Phase 2 Open Safely protocols has been announced by Jefferson Parish President Cynthia Lee Shang. Until further notice, masks or face coverings are now required in Jefferson Parish, which is the location of St. Louis King of France Church. In addition to masks, residents should continue social distancing and frequent hand washing. The term mask is officially defined as a cloth mask, scarf, bandana, or other cloth face covering, a face shield, or medical masks. This requirement to wear masks is triggered in the following situations: while indoors and in any common area in all commercial buildings, public buildings, restaurants, retail stores, and places of worship. This, of course, includes St. Louis King of France Church. So please, wear your masks to Mass. We do have some masks at the church entrance, but not enough for every person at every Mass. All employees who interact with the public must wear masks or face covering. Masks are required in any room or enclosed area where other people are present and unable to physically distance. No one else in the room at the moment, so just making a point here. Masks are required while walking through common areas such as hallways, stairways, elevators, and parking facilities. Masks are required while riding on public transportation. Violations will be considered a misdemeanor, which is generally punishable by up to a $500 fine or 6 months in jail. The parish president said she did not envision using incarceration, but she did emphasize that inspection and fines would be aggressive after a first warning is ignored. Otherwise, Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards has extended Phase 2 of the Open Safely protocols tentatively until July 24th, at which time a reevaluation will take place. This means 50% seating capacity is allowed at St. Louis King of France, that is 200 people, and we will keep pews roped off to assist. The COVID cocoon of 6 feet separation is still to be maintained. Family members are exempt from this and may sit together in the same pew, but even family members sitting together must wear masks in church. Otherwise, the 6-foot separation must be maintained in pews, in the communion line, and while entering and exiting the church. As for our sacramental life at St. Louis, we will continue as we have been for the past month. We will maintain our regular Mass schedule plus an extra vigil Mass. So on Saturday, we'll have 2 vigils, one at 2:30 p.m. and the second at 4 p.m. Sunday, Mass is at 9 a.m., 10:30 a.m., the Spanish Mass at noon, and evening Mass at 5 p.m. During the week, Mondays and Wednesdays, Mass is at 6:30 a.m. On Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday at 8:30 a.m. Confessions are heard before all Masses 7 days a week. The Sunday Mass obligation remains dispensed. Those who are ill or with medical vulnerabilities should remain safely at home. All other devotions, benediction, adoration, Rosary Holy Hour, all of those will continue unless another alteration is made, in which case we'll make an announcement about that. But so far, those are our plans. I've heard from many of you, either personally or calls, text, emails, a lot of different views on this. I'm not a medical doctor, so all I can say is those who spend their lives studying this, virology, say that the masks help to prevent spread. So I say, go ahead and do it. It is uncomfortable. I realize that, especially in New Orleans in the heat. I just had a funeral today, and the burial was outdoors, so I do understand. But if those who spend their lives studying this say it's the best thing to do, then we'll do it. And of course, this is the Archbishop has also, he's always aligned our church practice here with whatever the civil authorities stipulate, knowing that the civil authorities are consulting with medical authorities on this. So we are aligned in our approach to the COVID horror movie. Next, that's the update, phase 2 update done. Next, we move to the portion of the program exploring the duality of earthly existence between tidings of joy and lamentations of woe. The Bible explains in the book of Sirach, chapter 11, in the following words, verse 25. The day of prosperity makes one forget adversity. The day of adversity makes one forget the day of prosperity. King Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes was even more concise. Chapter 7, verse 3. Sorrow is better than laughter. When the face is sad, the heart grows wise. And so, on the dexter side of the diptych, that's the right hand, as follows. The combination of the parish and school offices in the rectory at St. Louis has been successfully completed. This enabled the repurposing of the previous school office space into 2 classrooms for our Little Crusader program. Enrollment has now filled both of those rooms. So, success. We have resumed Come Lord Jesus prayer group, the Rosary Holy Hour, the Sunday Spanish Mass, summer camp, Little Crusaders childcare, all following the Phase 2 Open Safely protocols. We had 7 baptisms last month in June. On June 17th, we held the postponed graduation for our school seniors. Confirmation, postponed by COVID, will take place on July 8th, 2020, that's next week, as part of a multi-parish event at St. Philip Neri Church. So gratitude to Archbishop Heyman, who will preside, and to Father Harry Bugler, who is the pastor of St. Philip and hosting this event. First Communion, postponed by COVID, has been rescheduled for Sunday, August 30th at the 10:30 a.m. Mass. This will include both our school students as well as CCD students enrolled who are attending public school. And of course, August, in the COVID time scale, that's 100 years from now. So, we had to set a date, just to let people get it on their schedules. So obviously, if future direction requires it, then we'll move that. But for now, it's August 30th at the 10:30 a.m. Mass. Owing to a series of very generous donations from one of our families, we have been able to retain a professional cleaning service for church, who have been keeping it looking like new. Owing to another donation from a generous parishioner, it's done now. We were able to replace some light fixtures the one shining on the St. Joseph statue and the Mary statue, as well as the lights in the sacristy and the Altar Society room. The deceased fixture, it was not just burnt out light bulbs, the fixtures just deceased. And they are no longer manufactured in the physical universe. So entirely new devices had to be purchased and installed. Which is a segue, since that, the extinction of those devices, that was an attack against me. So that is a segue from the tidings of joy to the lamentations of woe. And so next we will contrast these positive developments with the sinister panel of the diptych. That's the left hand. Remember that the new COVID income tax day is July 15th. That is 2 weeks away. The company that published the missalettes, that were formerly nestled in our pews, was devoured by a malevolent entity. So they instantly raised the price of these missalettes to $3,200. Therefore, no. We therefore cast it out, pronouncing Vade retro satana. While we were looking for a replacement, we found one that has English and Spanish. So, we had been getting a separate one for the Spanish Mass, but now we found one that has both English and Spanish. So we were able to reduce from 3 subscriptions to 1. And in the process, saving $1,200. So, perish all schemes of the unrighteous. Drink the poison yourselves. We have prevailed. Yet, this is not all. Further assaults from the netherworld have made use of the entropy of the physical universe, which, as we've covered in previous videos, is a result of original sin. Specifically, subterranean effluvia on our site, on the holy ground, requires excavation and replacement of some of the original pipes laid when St. Louis Parish was established. Estimated cost, if it does not require tunneling beneath the building, so this is the bargain basement price, $35,000. Of course, if excavation underneath the buildings must take place, then that price will go up. And then, of course, we can't just have an open ditch, so we have to, cover all of it back in, probably with asphalt. Meanwhile, another part of our campus, subsidence beneath the entrance to church has pulled down from beneath, remember this is demonic, so it's from below, pulled down convex pits, which are currently identified by large red cones in front of church for your safety. Correction of this problem, consisting of removing the existing surface, which is both concrete and brick, drilling 12 30-foot pylons, then replacing the surface, is estimated to cost $15,000. Clearly, these developments are of demonic orchestration. Yet, for those of you preferring scientific explanations, the story of how this came to be could be traced back to the Cretaceous period, when dinosaurs roamed the earth. But for the sake of time, we will confine ourselves to only recent developments. beginning 100 centuries ago, when the glaciers of the last ice age began to melt, draining into a mid-continental rift that we know as the Mississippi River Valley. 75 centuries ago, embryonic Louisiana materialized. Water from the melting glaciers pulled down the mid-continental rift by gravity, so it's higher ground going down to lower ground, water going downhill, emptied into an Atlantic Ocean basin. Now the 931-mile-wide Gulf of Mexico. Into this basin, sediment scoured from the interior of the continent, from Canada or Minnesota, from Minnesota on down, scoured from the interior of the continent, was dumped into this basin, settled into subaqueous mounds, underwater mounds of sediment, of dirt. It grew because the deposition continued, so the mounds grew into mountains, got higher and higher until they penetrated the surface and were no longer subaqueous. They became islands in the Gulf of Mexico. The deposition of the sediment continued all day and all night. The river continued to erode the center of the continent. So more sediment was deposited, more sediment, and as it did, then it was smoothed over into a lobe of new land that formed the very first delta of the Mississippi River, the first of six deltas. As deposition of crumbled sediment raised the elevation, gravity had to adjust, seeking the swiftest descent to the sea. So the water, as the sediment grew above water, the river's not going to jump over the new island. It's going to go around. So what had once been open water, filled in by a delta of deposited mud, was bypassed by later water flow, meaning that the river changed course. The new river channel repeated the process, dumping abraded sediment from up in the continental interior, which created underwater mounds that grew into underwater mountains that then penetrated the surface as islands, became smoothed over into a new lobe of land, a new delta for the Mississippi River, a second delta. Meanwhile, the previous delta remained. It was still there. It was still above ground, so we had new land. Onto this new land, Homo sapiens later settled. That's us. Every 10 to 15 centuries, this process repeated, creating 6 distinct deltas, lobes of mudland, filling in what had been the ocean basin, thereby creating southern Louisiana, where I now sit. The last occurred 5 centuries ago, down the Atchafalaya, but subsequent engineering intervention has prevented the natural diversion of the Mississippi down this new channel. And so the last lobe of land that is Plaquemine Parish, that it continues to extend further and further into the Gulf as the long toe of the state, such that from its source in Lake Itasca, Minnesota, the Mississippi River meanders down the center of the continent for 2,320 miles into the Gulf of Mexico. It drains 41% of the United States at an average rate of 3.5 million gallons of water per second. This cyclical diluvian process over 10,000 years deposited 3 million acres of land from Vermilion Bay in the west, that's where the city of Lafayette is now, to, well, not Vermilion, it's on the river, so upriver from the bay, but you know, from Vermilion Bay in the west to the Chandeleur Islands in the east. Right in the center of that, from Vermilion to Chandeleur, right in the center, is me. Right here, St. Louis, King of France, in Bucktown, Louisiana. We are, well, I am, within walking distance of the border between New Orleans and Jefferson Parish. Let's see, where am I? It's that way, which is the 17th Street Canal, where a breach occurred, causing some of the flooding that you watched, or depending on where you lived, experienced from Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Which brings us to the propensity for flooding of this 10,000 years of river-deposited sediment land. This propensity can be traced to the same etiology which brought the land into being. The land created by depositional lobes of dirt grew into successive deltas of mud, was not, and is not, the solid land of the continental shelf, but only the eroded sand, silt, and clay from upriver, combined with peat. Peat is formed by the decaying vegetation. So when all this mud was deposited, things grew on it. A swamp grew on it, you know, because it's not solid earth. It was just mud, but since it eroded all these nutrients and sediments from 41% of the continent deposited, and so some stuff was going to start to grow. But the land was always wet mud, so that's swamp. So eventually, the vegetation died, and then it becomes compacted, and layer of that compaction. Then the weight pushes it down, and that creates peat. So sand, silt, clay, and peat. Therefore, New Orleans is not built on solid ground. It is built on marshes. 65% is at or below sea level. Sea level is the level of Lake Pontchartrain. St. Louis, King of France, is on Lake Pontchartrain. Well, walking distance, it's a couple of blocks away. Lake Pontchartrain is 5 miles north of the Mississippi Crescent. So New Orleans was founded here on the Mississippi River. 5 miles north is Lake Pontchartrain. In 1718, New Orleans was constructed on a point of the river where it turned upward and had deposited sediment for 7,000 years. And so that point happened to be 17 feet above sea level in 1718. So it was settled that people, we talked about this in a previous video. Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, who's better known by his title Bienville, sited the city in 1718 in service of France. It was a French colony. Monetizing this point of land that happened to be above sea level brought thousands of settlers whose families grew into a population of 391,000 in Orleans Parish today and 434,000 in Jefferson Parish, where St. Louis, King of France is. And as, again, in other videos we've seen it, St. Louis we have territory on both sides of the line. So our address, the mailing address, the church is physically in Jefferson Parish, but we have territory on both sides of the line. So we are historic in a number of ways. So monetizing this point of land in New Orleans was to make it a port. Some of those settlers who came preferred to live on Lake Pontchartrain, while others preferred the river. Between the river and the lake, was 5 miles of swamp created by the diluvian process that we just discussed. Midway between the river and the lake, so halfway between there, distributaries of one of those ancient Mississippi River channels did something that affected the topography. So, the river, you have tributaries that empty into it and distributaries which empty away from it. So on a previous cycle of the diluvian process, the Mississippi River was on a different path than it is today. It had distributaries. And two of those, the remnants of two of those, are between the river and the lake. Around 600 BC, the meandering of the river was such that those distributaries were cut off from the river, meaning that they were no longer replenished by continental sediment. So those became bayous, internal streams. Metairie Bayou and Gentilly, it was Bayou Sauvage, but just Gentilly Bayou. Since they had been recipients of several millennia of sediment, the banks of those two bayous were higher than the surrounding swampland, about 3 to 5 feet above sea level. Ridges, so the shores, in other words, the banks of those rivers were higher, and those banks were ridges that were later paved over, so they still exist, Metairie Road and Gentilly Avenue. Preserving from death by drowning those people who chose to settle on the river, on the lake, or on the ridges in between has exercised the ingenuity of 3 centuries. More often than not, immigrants moved here to make their fortune rather than bringing a fortune with them. Such families who wanted a home naturally looked for a bargain. In 19th century Louisiana, that meant north of the city, so north of the river. Chopping down cedar trees in unsettled marsh and building a house, usually elevated. The problem was that moving north from the city of New Orleans, in other words, north from the French Quarter, meant moving downward in elevation. So the river is higher than Lake Pontchartrain. So the river here, even though on the map, the Lake Pontchartrain is to the north and the river's down here. So just looking at a map, it would look like it should be the reverse. But the river, you think of the river must be above sea level. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a river. This is gravity that takes the water down to the sea. Lake Pontchartrain is an estuary that opens onto the Gulf, which is part of the ocean. So Lake Pontchartrain, to the north of the city, is sea level. So the Mississippi River must be above sea level as it goes down, toward the Gulf. So if you're here in New Orleans and you want to settle north of the city to build a house and a place, and land that's very cheap, you're going down in elevation. But the city needed the workers. It's a port, and without the workers, the port would die. So they had to come up with a solution. Attempts began with what nature provided. Bayou St. John was a natural waterway by which the 5-mile extent of swampland between the river and the lake could be navigated mostly by canoe. So from Lake Pontchartrain, you go into Bayou St. John by canoe, and then go south toward the river. Now the bayou did not go all the way, but you could, when you reach the terminus of it, which is around where City Park is, then you could get out and just carry your canoe the rest of the way to the river. And that, the importance of that passage, the ability to do that, was noticed as early as 1701, 17 years before the city was established, such that the French placed a fortification at the intersection of Bayou St. John and Lake Pontchartrain. It was, when the French established it, it was Fort St. John, And then, as again we covered in previous videos, how Louisiana changed from being a French colony to a Spanish colony in 1763. So then the names were all changed, and it became, so it's now Old Spanish Fort. So those of you in Pius X Parish, you have Spanish Fort Road, and then further over, toward the Orleans. Anyway, you locals know what I mean. It's now the Old Spanish Fort. The trail of land over which one had to carry one's canoe from the southern end of Bayou St. John to get to the river, it was called Grand Route St. John, led to what is now Esplanade Avenue. So the French paved it. So Grand Route St. John is a street, Esplanade Avenue is a street, which goes to the river. Time passed. In 1791, the 5th Baron of Carondelet was appointed the 7th Spanish governor of Louisiana by King Carlos IV. 3 years later, in June of 1794, he began terraforming, the first phase of a scheme to connect the river to the lake entirely by water. This was the Carondelet Canal, 1.6 miles, extending from the southern end, so the lake's here, Bayou St. John, so extending from the southern end of Bayou St. John, south, to what they call the back of New Orleans. So that's the Treme. It was the plantation of Claude Treme, and it's still the neighborhood, the Treme. It's now, it was in, what are they called? The Iberville Housing Project. I think there's even a television series, but one of my students told me about that once, but it's on cable, which I don't have. But apparently there's a television series set in that neighborhood, Treme. Anyway, the neighborhood still exists. So this was 1.6 mile canal from the southern terminus of Bayou St. John to the back of New Orleans on the plantation of Claude Treme. It ended in a turning basin. So if you had ships that came down, barges, they had to be able to turn around. So this was an 80,000 square foot turning basin, which gave its name to Basin Street, which is still there. It served the dual purpose of drainage and shipping. 2 years later, in 1796, a Norman French immigrant named Jacques Pitot arrived in New Orleans. He became interested in the commercial possibilities of this canal. He did very well as a merchant. He became a member of the city council, and after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, he served as the first American mayor of New Orleans. And he completed the city's first charter, the first city charter, as an American city. 2 years later, after the purchase, so this brings us to 1805, he turned the Carondelet Canal into a toll waterway and used the proceeds to widen it and deepen it to accommodate larger vessels and barges. He formed a company to manage the canal, which it continues to do after his death. They, his successors in the company, turned it into a monopoly and continued raising prices until they priced themselves out of the market and provoked competition. The Louisiana Purchase opened a period of population explosion in New Orleans as Americans moved in to capitalize more on the riverbanks and the lakeshore, thereby continuing the need of more residential land. So the need to reclaim more land from the marshes between the river and the lake. So upriver from New Orleans, the founder of New Orleans, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, Bienville, had a 1 mile tract of riverfront land, prime real estate land, that was his. A lot of things happened with him. He really got shafted in a lot of ways by the French, even though he was very loyal. Anyway, the land had changed hands a number of times. It was sold and resold until it was finally acquired in 1781 by a guy named Bartholomew McCarty, who monetized its soil to cultivate sugarcane. And he passed it on to his heirs. On the 5th of May, 1816, McCarty's descendants witnessed a nightmare. The levee of the Mississippi River failed on their estate, opening a crevasse, which is a trench, essentially just opened a trench in the levee that flooded the entire city. So the river, it went back to its natural, just started flooding the area, which is what it was always doing, before the levees were created. So it flooded the entire city until, now this is from the river in the south. So New Orleans is at this point. So upriver from New Orleans is Carrollton, where the McCarty plantation, which we'll talk about, but now it's the neighborhood of Carrollton, where the seminary is. The crevasse opened in 1816 there, flooded all Carrollton, all the city, and north toward the lake until it was stopped by Metairie Ridge and Gentilly Ridge. The problem is the area in between the river and those ridges, all that area between is below sea level. It doesn't have any natural drainage, so it's a bowl. And so the water was just staying there, just sitting there. And so until they artificially punctured a hole into those ridges, so that, again, on a map it doesn't look right. Did you think, okay, you want to drain up north, but remember, elevation is going down. So going up to it's going down. So they punctured the ridge to drain the water to the lake. And they remembered that. Draining the city toward the lake, toward the north. So you remember that. Because this is going to explain what happens next. The need to avert such catastrophes in the future, along with ongoing need of opening more settlement area, as despite all of this, people were still coming because of the port. That was it. It was a way to make a living. It's not only even people who didn't actually work on the port or work in shipping. They're all sort of ancillary thing. They need all those people. They need food. They need clothes. The kids need to go to school. They need lawyers. They need doctors. They need dentists. So there's a whole panoply needed. That's why the cities grow around ports. So the need to do all of this instigated a major initiative to systematize local government. Essentially, not creating, because we did have government before, but to make it more systematic. Yet, ethnic tensions continued to get in the way between the French population, their descendants, against the incomers, the Americans, who were mostly of Anglo or German or Irish or Scottish descent. So these tensions prompted the Americans, the new settlers, to obtain from the state of Louisiana a separate jurisdiction on February 11th, 1825. In a previous video, we talked about the original city is the French Quarter, and the east-west boundaries are Canal Street and Esplanade. So on the other side of Canal Street, there was a plantation, the Gravier Plantation, and the guy who owned that started subdividing it into neighborhoods. The French word for a neighborhood, a suburb, is a faubourg. So the Faubourg Sainte-Marie. And he started, even though he was French, he just wanted to make money. So he started subdividing it into lots and selling it to the American settlers. So even though now that's the CBD, that's part of New Orleans, at that time it was not. And in 1825, the state agreed to incorporate that as a separate municipality. And since Louisiana only became part of the United States because of Thomas Jefferson, he was the president who did the Louisiana Purchase, and Jefferson happened to still be alive in 1825. He died the next year, on July 4th, 1826, but he was still alive. So this new civil parish, whatever everywhere else in the country would be called a county, was created and named in his honor, Jefferson Parish. And Jefferson Parish is right here. This is where St. Louis King of France campus resides. However, the original boundaries of Jefferson Parish started at Felicity Street in what is now New Orleans and extended all the way upriver. So New Orleans is here, so all the way upriver to St. Charles Parish line. So the original Jefferson Parish included a significant part of what is now New Orleans. And it was subdivided into municipalities, separate cities, which were part of Jefferson Parish, as well as some unincorporated land that was never turned into a city. So this included Lafayette City, which should not be confused with the existing Diocese of Lafayette, which is also in Louisiana, but it's far away. It's, well, not far, but it's about 3 hours to the west, 3 hours drive to the west. This Lafayette City was within what is now New Orleans, but then it was part of Jefferson Parish. And it included the Redemptorist Parish, where Blessed Silos served, and that's where he died of the yellow fever. We talked about that in a previous video, the third yellow fever video, about the outbreak in 1867, which claimed his life. So that was Lafayette City. Jefferson City, as distinct from Jefferson Parish, this was Jefferson City in Jefferson Parish, included the present-day Garden District. That was the American section. So it was the rich outsiders coming in and building these huge townhouses and mansions, at the time outside of New Orleans. Carrollton City, which is where Notre Dame Seminary is. That's where I teach. That's another job I have. And a place, it was just to dig against the French. They chose this ostentatious British name of a borough, the borough of Freeport, which was from Toledano to Joseph Street. So I guess that's those locals where Ursuline High School is. That area kind of was a different city. Yet, political, economic, ethnic antipathy aside, New Orleans and Jefferson shared the same topography, the same river to lake problem with the swamp in between, the same need for drainage. They competed in this as in everything else. Meanwhile, the population expansion continued, such that profit was to be made in monetizing the act of physical movement. Transport, essentially, the transportation business from outlying residential communities into the city and back. The result was 6 short-line commuter railroads. The first, 1830, was the 6-mile-long Pontchartrain Railroad. This was the first railroad to carry goods and passengers by rail from New Orleans in the south to Lake Pontchartrain in the north. It functioned for a century. The railroad itself is gone, but the route still exists. It's paved. That in locals, this is Elysian Fields. So it went from the river to UNO's campus on the lakefront, which then was Milneburg, named after a guy, Alexander Milne, which was also a separate town, by the way, on the lake. Okay. The following year, Jefferson Parish struck back. 1831, the Canal and Banking Company raised capital to terraform another waterway through the 5-mile swamp between the river and the lake. The result was the new Basin Canal. So the original, the Basin Canal, that was the Carondelet Canal, became the Basin Canal. But that's New Orleans. So this is Jefferson. This is going to be the new Basin Canal. Stretching a little over 3 miles in length. It was another toll canal, starting from Lake Pontchartrain this time, not from the rest, starting from Lake Pontchartrain in the north, and there's still a lighthouse there. So the New Basin Canal Lighthouse, which is it was destroyed in Katrina, but because of its historic significance, it was brought back, so it's still there. So that's on the lake. It started there, and it pointed south. The canal pointed south through the swamp, ending up at its own turning basin. This one at Rampart and Howard Avenue, so that's in the present-day CBD, which was the Faubourg Sainte-Marie, which, remember, at this point is not part of New Orleans. Now it is, but at this point it was not. It was part of Jefferson, so it was their access from the river to the sea, so they wouldn't be dependent on New Orleans. A generation later, Jefferson Parish laid down a competitor railroad, the Pontchartrain Railroad. A competitor to the Pontchartrain Railroad. This was the Jefferson and Lake Pontchartrain Railroad, which was simply situated alongside their canal, alongside the New Basin Canal, and which some SLKF parishioners today remember using. Some of you listening to this, you've told me the stories about walking across the 17th Street Canal, catching it, going into the city, back, So I remember those stories you tell me. I guess I shouldn't use any, I won't use full names, but Monica, I'm thinking of you. You're the one who told me your stories. This canal and railroad are now gone, but its route can be followed as the Pontchartrain Expressway portion of Interstate 10 and West End Boulevard. So how was this made? This kind of labor doesn't just happen. So it's estimated that between 8,000 and 20,000, depending on if you include just the canal dredging or if you also include the railroad construction, between 8,000 and 20,000 Irish immigrants died while dredging the canal and building the railroad. For that reason, even though it's all gone now, on West End there's a big wide green space. That's where the canal was and the railroad on one side. There is a Celtic cross, which was put up in 1990 in commemoration of their loss, because many of them, when they died, they just, when they dredged out the canal, they just dumped it on the side to create essentially levees on the side. So when these guys would die, mostly of the yellow fever, they just leave them there, and just dump dirt on top of them. So just treated just like garbage. So in 1990, because of that, they were, this monument was put up in their honor, and it's still there. It's on West End Boulevard. So back in New Orleans, in the same year as 1831, an engineer hired by the state named George Dunbar proposed an ambitious system of drainage canals for New Orleans, which was not part of the Jefferson Parish project, because you remember they hate each other, they're rivals. So Dunbar's vision was to drain water by gravity into the low-lying swamps toward the lake, supplementing this with canals and mechanical pumps to make it go faster. Essentially, creating by design a permanent outlet such as the one that was created as an emergency measure to drain the water from the 1816 crevasse from the river through Metairie Ridge to the lake. The result was the earliest version of the Orleans Canal, which was not exactly, at least all of it, was not exactly where it is today. Originally, it started just as a drainage ditch, excavated alongside Orleans Avenue, which is still here, from the Tremé neighborhood into Bayou St. John. So it's like the Carondelet Canal, which had been allowed to fall into disuse, so they redredged, essentially. The first Orleans Canal was redredging the Carondelet Canal. And to move the water faster, he invented what was called the Bienville drainage machine. It was essentially a paddle wheel that he took off of a riverboat, hooked up to a steam engine, situated at the corner of Hagan and Bienville streets. And his intent was that it would just push the water down the Orleans Canal into Bayou St. John and thence into the lake. And that was only one part of the scheme. He had a number of canals planned to do this, but the scheme remained unfinished owing to a financial collapse in 1837 that damaged the national economy, not just New Orleans. So everybody forgot. Well, not forgot, but the scheme of using the 1816 strategy and making it permanent endured, prompting generations of engineers and real estate investors to terraform 3 major outfall canals draining water into Lake Pontchartrain to the north. So from the east to the west, so from the New Orleans side to the Jefferson side, there's the London Avenue Canal, which is 2.8 miles long. Then in the middle is the Orleans Avenue Canal, where it is now, is 2.8 miles long. And the third is right here, the 17th Street Canal, which is 2.5 miles long, along the boundary of Orleans and the current boundary between Orleans and Jefferson Parish, right here in St. Louis King of France Parish. These 3 outflow canals achieved Dunbar's vision of opening swampland to settlement. By 1945, that was considered done. That all of the area that had been swamped between the river and the lake, I mean, not that every inch had a house on it, but it was no longer considered swamp. It had been drained enough that houses could be built on it. So they did achieve Dunbar's dream, but all actions have consequences, foreseen and unforeseen. So the foreseen consequence was achieved, the drainage. The unforeseen consequence was reduction of the groundwater table, triggering underground subsidence in the drained area. And that subsidence continues to this day. St. Louis King of France Parish and the homes surrounding in Bucktown are among those habitations only made possible because of the drainage canals. Yet, we're also among those who suffer the side effect of the reclaimed swampland sinking beneath us. Case in point, the ground on the north side entrance to the church, the side facing the lake, facing the Lorio Center, is subsiding to such a degree that you regulars will have already seen the cones steering you away from the concave pits caused by the lowering water table. The subterranean moisture loss accelerates biochemical oxidation of the river-deposited sediment, which created the ancient swamp. That ancient swamp now trapped beneath our paved streets. Therefore, as that ancient swamp disintegrates, the roads and buildings above it are slowly sinking into thousands of years of now disappearing Pleistocene mud. So now you have a decision. You can either believe and internalize that historical and scientific explanation, or you can adopt a more spiritual perspective and regard all of this, meaning the sinking, the concave pits in front of church, the subterranean effluvia, regard all of this as an eons-long demonic conspiracy against me. 10,000 years in the making. The demons in their pit gathered, conspired, formulated this plan to torment me. So the choice is yours. Either believe the science of subsidence, diluvian processes, science of subsidence, or believe that demonic agencies are attacking me. Either way, we still have to pay for it. If you are able to assist financially at this time, you can do so online by clicking the Support St. Louis link below this video, or if you prefer, using the Postal Service, mail-in donations using the mail-in address, which is also below this video. Thank you to all of those who have been supporting us, especially during the COVID enclosure. For those of you who are not able to assist us financially at this time, please do continue to assist us spiritually with your prayers. And we'll close with a prayer, but again, remember, wear your masks when you come to Mass, when you come to church. Keep them on. You can obviously you can take them off to receive communion, but those who are giving out communion, like me, the deacon, Eucharist ministers, we will have them on, when you receive communion. So we'll end with a prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Almighty God, we pray that you grant us the wisdom to discern what is right, the will to choose it, and the strength to make it endure. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. St. Louis, King of France, pray for us. Our Lady of Prompt Succor, hasten to help us. In conclusion, stay cautious, stay calm, stay safe. Thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.